just a minute, is a professor of development studies at the University of Manchester, where he's an executive director of the Global Development Institute. He's also CEO of Effective States and Inclusive Development Research Centre and Future Dams Research Centre. These are institutions involved in interdisciplinary partnerships across Africa, Asia, Europe, and North America. David had a long and distinguished career in global development. He describes himself as a broad-based social scientist with interest in economics, sociology, and political science. And he's been, I think, for almost 35 years at the University of Manchester. For the last 20 years, he's focused on global poverty. And he's also founder director of the Chronic Poverty Research Centre. Most recently, he's become interested in the way that perhaps we need to focus on the concept of global development as opposed to international development, because the notion of international development is a kind of binary, it's a binary thing, which global north, global south, developing, which doesn't work so well now. So he's become increasingly interested in that. Anyway, without more ado, I will hand over to you, David, to do your talk. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks very much. And I'll see then if I can put up the PowerPoint that I've got. Is that working?
Yes.
Okay, and then if I do that, and then that. Okay, tonight, thanks very much for inviting me. I wish I could be in Leeds, but I'll have to do that at some future stage. But thanks for inviting me, and it's a great privilege to be able to talk to you tonight. I mean, Jane and colleagues at Café Économique had asked me whether I'd be interested in looking at global development scenarios, a post-COVID-19 world, because I'd written about this last year, and so that's what I'm going to talk about. And I've called it the ugly, the bad, and the good. I did think about the good, the bad, and the ugly, but when I was initially doing work on this topic, I thought an ugly outcome seemed more likely than a good outcome. But I'll talk about my present position, because things have changed a lot since 15 months ago when I really started looking at this issue. And if one is looking at COVID-19, then one certainly got to sort of, in these few words of introduction, note just how profound the effects have been. And those effects have been both proximate and longer term. I'll talk a little bit about both of these a little bit later. But the proximate term and effects clearly are increased deaths, economic slowdown, loss of jobs, but there are also longer term effects. COVID-19 has impacted on multilateralism. It's impacted incredibly on scientific capacity and the capacity to develop vaccinations. So there are a number of long-term impacts, some of which may be beneficial, such as raised scientific capacity, some of which may be very concerning, such as perhaps a weakening of multilateralism in some aspects. It's had amazing impacts on policies, and particularly at the national level, probably the UK being the most obvious. A country that was absolutely committed, with governments committed to austerity, has suddenly just said, we've got a magic money tree, we can spend money like mad. And it's only now beginning to be talked about being reined in. But that's not uncommon in high income and middle income countries, and certainly many low income countries. They haven't been able to boost their public expenditure on the scale that high income countries have, but they have actually moved into having social protection and spending more money. The original work I did on this, and I hope I'm not too outdated on it, was about now is the time to think about later. But when I was working on this with a colleague back in May 2020, then we really felt that the obvious focus is on the here and now, but actually for those of us who are academics and might be able to advise social movements and activist groups, then we would want really to think about how do we get involved in conversations now so that we can actually change the way that things are operating. The scenarios we went for were good, bad, and ugly, and certainly going back to May well, April and May 2020, I was certainly worried about the possibility of a very ugly outcome. I'd been amazed in 2007-8 that the global financial meltdown, I mean, capitalism nearly threw itself over a cliff. But we got next to no reforms to the finance or banking sector out of the fact that unregulated capitalism had nearly destroyed itself. Now sort of, yeah, we're 15 months on, so it's early later. And that may mean that Rory and my work is a little dated, but we've tried to keep up to speed. This is a vast canvas, and I'll only be able to touch on a small number of issues. I definitely can't claim to be expert on many of those issues, and there may be some important issues we probably won't touch on, but we could maybe go into those in questions and answers if there's something that you think is really missing. I'm now following the sort of evolution of the pandemic, following events, but I'm not immersed in it. And I'm aware that certainly some academics have immersed themselves in COVID-19. I'm keeping an eye on it, but also looking at other things I worked on. And then finally, I mean, I've used this term post-COVID-19 in my title, but my thought on that is, if only, this does seem to be a pandemic which is going to be with us perhaps for long historical periods, potentially like influenza. And so it does look as though we have to work out how to live with it, hopefully live with it in ways which are nothing like as damaging as they have been over the last 15 to 18 months. But I don't think we're going to put this coronavirus behind us. So if I start off by thinking about these proximate effects and that, and they are pretty well known. Increased mortality was the obvious one. People dying more quickly, prematurely when they got COVID-19, particularly in the early months before the treatments were known and before we knew about certainly how to treat, how they were not simple respiratory diseases. There was an economic slowdown, which, I mean, some countries are still trying to come out of. Certainly in Latin America, the slowdown there has been deep and has continued, but it's been very unevenly spread across sectors and across different actors. And some aspects of economic slowdown have been very good for some sectors and some actors, whilst at exactly the same time, they've almost destroyed the businesses in other sectors or of other actors. Certainly one of the important things for me, because I've been looking at global poverty over the last 20 years, is increased extreme poverty. There is a crude measure which the World Bank uses, which is $1.90 a day of consumption at purchasing power parity terms. That's a very low line. You have to be extremely poor, really subsisting on that. But using that measure has been going down steadily from around about 1.8 billion to around about 800, around about 500, 600 million. It's jumped up 140 million over 2020 and is still probably around about something like 100 to 150 million people who are experiencing extreme poverty. If you were to set the line higher and say at $3.20, which is another measure that's sometimes used, then one would find that certainly a much larger group of people, perhaps twice that number, would now be regarded as having fallen into poverty. As I said, I mean, it's a terrible thing in itself at the individual level. It's terrible at this scale, but also really since 1990, we've been looking at extreme poverty, the numbers going down and the percentage of the population around the globe going down, but that has been reversed by the pandemic. One of the key sectors that was really being hit is the informal sector, and certainly the lockdowns that many governments introduced in low-income and middle-income countries really added to the problems of the informal sector and increased inequality. I'll talk a little bit about that later on, but certainly if you're in the informal sector in rural or urban areas, probably particularly in urban areas, then your standard of living dropped pretty dramatically. In lower income countries, millions, tens of millions of people have moved into rural areas and are staying in those rural areas. I particularly look at Bangladesh, and in Bangladesh, we've certainly had more than 5 million people leave cities and urban places and move into suburban or rural areas. And they're only very slowly returning to the city now, partly because they're in the informal sector and really had nothing to fall back on when the informal sector market closed down in cities like Bangladesh, but equally in India, in all the Indian cities when Prime Minister Modi suddenly called the lockdown. There was reduced schooling, and no schooling became common in most parts of the world. And so there were pretty dire consequences, but one can find potentially some indicators that seem to get positive. There were reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and certainly I was hosting a seminar for the United Nations Development Programme this afternoon, and they're still trying to pursue the way in which greenhouse gas emissions reduced, and trying to convert that into policies that mean that's a permanent effect in many countries. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals that the UN's 193 member countries have agreed on, have certainly stalled many aspects of them, and their progress and advance has slowed down. If we look at longer term effects, then we can look certainly what's been happening at the national level and also internationally and globally. Certainly at the national level, then reduced literacy and skills seems to have occurred, and that's especially for poorer households, whether you're looking in the UK or whether you're looking in Bangladesh. Generally, poorer households didn't have laptops, didn't have good mobiles, didn't have good internet signals. So even if there was an attempt to move to virtual education, they couldn't take advantage of that. And the evidence is also indicating certainly in low-income Asia and low-income Africa, that children from poorer households, even when schools have been opened up, then they've tended to have higher dropout rates or higher no return rates than children coming from higher income households. There's been certainly increased debt for many households, but in particular, work that colleagues have been doing in Bangladesh that I follow closely has pointed out to reduce savings for the poor. And I think in the sort of references resources that I've listed at the end of this PowerPoint, which I mean, put it on the website, Jane, or anyway, it can be distributed, and that I've put down the Harishi Para Diaries. But I have a colleague, he and I set up a sort of observatory in a village in Bangladesh 20 years ago, but he's intensified that and has been looking at 60 households every day over the last 18 to 20 months. And so he's been able to chart the way in which they've responded at household level to COVID-19, to the lockdowns, to the post-lockdowns, to the new lockdowns. And the key thing that comes out from his work is that actually even very poor people have savings, because you cannot trust what is going to happen in the future. And in the first lockdown in Bangladesh, those savings were eked out to keep people living over the 3-4 weeks that the economy was really closed down. The problem that people have faced, because there's been a second lockdown and there may be perhaps future lockdowns, is their savings are now wiped out. And so a key device they have, which they keep to hand, has gone. I mean, that affects COVID-19, but it also affects if somebody gets sick in the house, if a cow dies, if anything bad happens in that house. Evidence of increased economic and social inequality. COVID-19 seemed to cause damage for poorer houses, and then the impacts often on poorer households were greater. I've put this sort of mortality hidden mortality thing there, but one of the awful things you realize when you study extreme poverty is that when households are extremely poor or fall into extreme poverty, then you get increased mortality. And that often shows us fewer poor people, because if poor people die at a faster rate, then you may actually think poverty is reducing if you count it in terms of how many living poor people there are. And so I think we've had economic and social inequality, but some of that is hidden because what's been lost is through mortality. And in a way, people who would have been struggling have actually passed away and have lost all their future opportunities, all their future life chances. Weakened or vulnerable health services and systems. Again, around the world, whether we look at the UK and the tremendous strain our health service was under and continues to be under because it isn't able to catch up, but similarly in many other countries, in India and in Peru in particular, I had students there and they reported to me just the way that the health systems were just absolutely collapsing under the strain of so many people sick. This has led to increased public debt, increased national debt in many countries. I think this was being pointed out at the Conservative Party conference yesterday, that debt levels have certainly increased up 20, 30, 40%. This has happened across most countries. But again, it is the high income countries that may actually have upped their spending the highest in percentage terms. If one's looking, I don't know, potentially for good effects, then there has been a rapid shift to home working in high income countries and in middle income countries. And it's been demonstrated in many industry, many office based industries that you don't actually need to be at work. And so there is this potentially substantial reduction in carbon footprints for many people that could be realized, which might be able to move us towards slightly greater opportunities for reducing carbon. If we look at the international and the global effects with this, my computer has corrected me and it's Roderick shouldn't have the C and it should be just be R-I-K. But Danny Roderick, who was arguing against hyper-globalization policies, about this idea that you must maximize your international trade, you must join up in global value chains as much as you can do, then certainly he's pointed out that what he was arguing should have been happening in 2010. Well, 10 years later, it has begun to happen in 2020, and countries are being more cautious about outsourcing everything, about assuming that global markets can meet all of the needs they might have. Certainly, there's less talked about austerity and the idea that austerity is automatically good and all countries should be thinking about minimizing public expenditure. That's out, and certainly questions nowadays about increasing debt levels, but looking at the affordability of debt levels depending on the interest rates that different countries are paying. And interestingly, in low-income countries and middle-income countries, quite a lot of them have, as in high-income countries, have extended their social protection schemes. They're now covering urban workers and low-paid in urban workers more effectively. They're looking at whether it's possible to have social protection schemes and unemployment devices that could support the informal sector. But certainly ideas about supporting and the public resources supporting poorer people have, in a way, have advanced over the period. Multilateralism can certainly be seen as both having some successes, but also having some problems. If one was to look for successes, then certainly forms of scientific collaboration, data exchange have improved. The creation of COVAX, the World Health sort of organizations, well, designed by the World Health Organization, but the organization that's looking at spreading vaccinations out. It's not having a lot of success, but it is a new institutional arrangement, which if it could improve its performance, would be available in the future. Obviously, one is looking for undermining of multilateralism. One had multiple instances of that while Donald Trump was president, with the way that he was trying to act nationally and really trying to undermine international and UN action. One also does have the awful figures that I'll talk about in terms of vaccine access, but the appallingly low levels of access to vaccines that low-income countries, and particularly the African continent, has. Nationalist and populist ideologies may have strengthened in some parts of the world, but they may have weakened in others. I think the jury is out on that at the moment, but that's a very important, in a way, relatively invisible resource to be looking at is the degree to which the rise of nationalism and populism has been supported by COVID-19 or maybe undermined by it. Certainly between country inequality has increased, and certainly rich and emerging countries, particularly China, have been able to bounce back quicker, and China's economic growth after taking an initial hit has continued pretty robust, and China's incomes and its position in the world economy have increased. With the UN Sustainable Development Goals, one can certainly argue that they've had much less attention, because attention has focused upon COVID-19, upon health problems, but other problems such as access to education, such as gender inequality, have probably been played down to a degree by this focus upon the disease and its, in a way, immediate treatment. So I get back to the sort of paper that Rory and Horn and I wrote back in mid-2020. We came up with 3 scenarios, and we thought it was important to look at these scenarios because the historical record shows that major changes in the policies and the relations involved in global development usually require something very dramatic to happen. They require a World War II or a World War I or the end of the Cold War. And in a way, these critical junctures don't occur very often, but the way in which the world economy began to close down and narrow down, in a way, the fear that was generated by the initial pandemic suggested that the COVID-19 pandemic might create this critical global juncture when one could try and think about how could one improve systems or global policies. And we came up with 3 scenarios. There's the ugly, which would see SDGs achievement reduce from 2019 levels. It would see weakening national and global governance, and it would see the possibility of a global meltdown, a long-term reduction in global productivity, in economic living standards, and in human development. The bad basically said, well, maybe we'll take this COVID-19 fright, but things will just return to the way they were in 2019. And that would be bad because we weren't dealing with major problems adequately at that stage. Good would be that COVID-19 leads to a focus at national and international levels at tackling the immediate crisis, but also thinking about longer term improvements to national governance and global governance, and that it might lead to the fact of a recognition that really to manage COVID-19 and the mutants and variants effectively, then you too require a global forms of collaboration to reduce the likelihood of mutation, to reduce the likelihood of the transmission of new mutations. If we look at the ugly then, back in April, May 2020, I was very pessimistic. I thought the global meltdown was probably needed to be looked at, the possibility of a whole era of crisis, not a year or two, but a decade of crisis, perhaps dystopia. Not actually, well, the Third World War, one could have even thought about it then, because certainly with Donald Trump being fairly erratic, the way in which he was aggravating China, the possibility just of some small-scale clash leading to bigger problems could be imagined. And that saw 3 main ways in which a global meltdown might occur. The first one would be if the coronavirus itself could simply keep ahead of science. And if the coronavirus had kept ahead of science, then that would have meant continued high mortality rates, continued extraordinary levels of fear, and it would have been very difficult to click national and the international economy back into action. The second, in a way, was that COVID-19 would be badly managed, and actually that the protection and the bailouts would go to wealthier people, would go to industries and activities which were damaging the climate, the public indebtedness would reach levels that begin to mean that that a whole set of nations are seen as potentially falling into bankruptcy, and so that the international financial system begins to be hit. Democracy weakened, as strong men say, a pandemic needs strong government, and international cooperation weakened as countries try to take national approaches to solving the problem. The third possibility for a global meltdown was what I've called a double whammy here. Those of you maybe who've been mountaineers or read about mountaineering may sort of spot this one. Often when there's a crisis, it's not the crisis itself, the first thing that leads to deaths. It's when there's a second problem, a second crisis, and you can maybe manage one, but you cannot manage two. And certainly the impacts of COVID-19, had they been alongside another global crisis, might have put the world into a spin. If Chinese real estate market had collapsed, then stock markets around the world would have just fallen. Had there been a subprime wheeze, I think there may be a subprime wheeze that we don't know about in Wall Street or London at the moment, but had that emerged at that stage, it would have hit us. Had the sort of the platforms for banking, for finance, in a way for communications, had they collapsed, then we'd have found ourselves in a world in which we couldn't access money or finance, we couldn't buy or trade or get the things that we wanted. With the wisdom of hindsight, I mean, I wonder whether that was too pessimistic, but I don't know. Donald Trump certainly was president at that stage, which allowed one to think of a broader set of outcomes. And I'd still say, even if it was too pessimistic, it was too pessimistic this time around, but we get these forms of crisis every 10 to 20 years. So whether we'll be lucky and we won't get a double whammy next time around. The bad, as I said, was to return to the world of 2019. That would be about tackling climate change, the climate crisis, in a very haphazard way, delaying it, allowing, in fact, sort of global warming and the change of the climate to accelerate, to keep talking about going down to 1.5 or 2.0, but still as we are at the moment. If we continue as we are today, then it's 3.6 degrees Celsius we should get, and it may be more if there are quantum leaps that we haven't looked at. The second thing that is bad is that inequality within countries could continue to deepen, and certainly inequality within countries over the last 20, 25 years has been increasingly common. It's Latin America that hasn't been getting increased inequality, but it had excessively high levels already. And there's also polarization. It's not just the overall way in which wealth is spread and power and influence of wealth is created, but it is what has been called the 1%, what may now be the 0.1%, but these 10 to 20 people who have the same wealth as the other 50, there's the bottom 50% of the world population. And that clearly looks like it is going to continue. Existing institutional trends, if they continue, the weakening of democracy, which has been going on the last 10 to 15 years, the rise of populism, this approach to fear-mongering is what political leaders and what political parties do, misinformation, and the destruction of sort of public management systems, the sort of project that someone like Dominic Cummings was involved in which the public management, public administration is blamed for everything, and you try to clear it out rather than recognizing how important having a functioning civil service and public service is. And the bad scenario would see multilateralism and international cooperation weakening, aid budgets reducing, commitments not being made, or if commitments are made, they're not honored and governments get away with it. And just looking at some of the data about what's sort of been happening on that, then certainly if one looks at the inequality data, it was alarming and it continues to be alarming. I mean, it happens in terms of average income. That's what you've got on the right here, and this extraordinary differences that we have, in which we've got Qatar well over $100,000, the the USA at $54,000, a global average of 15,500 in purchasing power parity terms. But the Central African Republic and certainly low-income African countries under $1,000, 100 times less than Qatar, only 1/15 of the global average income. But this knocks out into mortality, and there's figures there on mortality just showing how high the infant mortality rate remains in many countries. Even though the global average has dropped, then the global average is way above what's being achieved in high income countries. Life expectancy at birth still low in many African countries, mean years of schooling, expected years of schooling. So in a way, we are living in a world in which there are high levels of inequality, whether you're thinking economic measures or whether you're thinking in terms of human development. And certainly many of those patterns appear to be continuing. Extreme poverty had been reducing, but still we've got large numbers of people who are living the most basic of lives, have access to the most basic of services. If one looks at some global income distribution figures, then this would say overall that global income distribution is improving, but you'll still see in a way for a Gini curve like this, that it's incredibly close to the bottom and then it rises in the right-hand side up. We live in an incredibly unequal world in that sense. The advances we've made in terms of reducing global income distribution are in a way between countries. The rise of China, the rise of India actually mean that, global income distribution appears to be improving. But when you look within countries, if you look within India and within China, then you find out that at the national level, income inequality is increasing within those countries. And so if you look at your neighbors, then it's quite reasonable to say, I'm being left behind. Even though your living standard, your income may have improved, it doesn't look like it's improving as much as many other people's. And if we look at the good scenario, this was actually saying maybe COVID-19 and post-COVID-19, we could move to a better world. That would require quite a few changes. It would require certainly tackling the triple crisis the world faced in 2020, both short term, but also longer term. There'd have to be a renewal of public health services, both investment in public health services immediately and longer term, but also in the idea of public health. And the idea of public health in many countries has been undermined, or certainly has been underfunded. It hasn't been supported by finance, with a greater emphasis on people should be paying for their own health services or paying for their own insurance to get curative services. If one was seeing the renewal, then would be looking at greater investment, the promotion of the idea of public health, improvements in global health institutions in their research and development, but one would also be thinking about how does one disperse the manufacturing of key medical products, and how does one strengthen the World Health Organization and move to innovative institutions such as Gavi and COVAX and making them work. If one looks at inequality, then in a way to have a good scenario, one would move to a position in which inequality is not being allowed to simply deepen from the high levels it's at into higher levels within countries, but that inequality would be tackled. Progressive taxation would occur at the national level, but also at the global level. Social protection would be promoted, and the possibility of spending, of public spending on social protection would be recognized. Policies of social and economic inclusion, reduce tax evasion and reduce money laundering. And that's something that we can talk about, we should talk about in the UK, because London remains a global lead in tax evasion. It's the place where people go to get connected with the places they can then register their companies and hide the beneficial interests that are recommended. We'd have to think about effective aid policies, and we'd have to think about social norms. The position where being as wealthy as Zuckerberg or Gates would be seen as embarrassing. People would say that's obscene. You should not be that greedy, rather than seeing these people as people to be emulated. It would also mean tackling climate change in terms of both mitigation and adaptation, much more finance and much more support for actions to tackle climate change. And more broadly, it would mean, in a way, a return to the spirit of multilateralism, which has been waning over the last 10 years. Ideas about global public investment in global public goods, ensuring that there is global crisis preparedness, and that if another disease comes along, if a financial crisis occurs, that we have some ways that we could deal with that, and changing social norms so that people begin to accept that actually it may be better to live in societies that are not so unequal, because you can just walk down the street and relax much more than you can in societies where you begin to get inequality and sometimes social and political breakdown. So when I looked at these, in a way, moving on 15 months, then I think we've avoided the ugly. At the moment, COVID-19 appears to be manageable. We haven't had a double whammy. And the US, with the recent elections, has improved its contribution in a way to global thinking and the global community. But that's far from guaranteed. I think the bad is where we were. Climate change is still an enormous problem, which is only being scratched at. The Paris Agreement was weak. If you look at that, you see lots of smiling national leaders putting their arms around each other, but actually they're smiling because it hasn't collapsed. It hasn't been a failure. They're not smiling because it was a great success and we've reached targets that would get us forward. At Glasgow, well, let's hope COP26 goes well, but there are certainly criticisms of what is happening at COP26. It's hard to say that the leadership coming from the UK has been particularly powerful and persuasive. There's been a bounce back in greenhouse gases. Aeroplanes are flying again. Their carbon emissions have hardly reduced at all in terms of the emissions per kilometer they fly. Cars are being used again. People are returning to work. We're really dependent very much in belief in unknown scientific advances. To achieve 2050, to reach sort of zero carbon, then we're going to need to sequester carbon. And we really have no technologies which can sequester carbon at the rate that is required. If we're looking at planting forests, then we're going to have to give up eating food, because we're going to have to plant all of our agricultural land with trees if we're going to use trees as this device. And so climate change definitely is not in a good position. Inequality, very little change. Shareholder capitalism continues with, in a way, attempts to maximize short-term profits for small groups of people. My colleague Rory Horn and I have written about converging divergence. Those global figures, that global income chart that I showed you, may show a slight improvement from 2003 to 2013, but at the national level, then divergence and polarization, more and more of the new wealth that's being created, concentrating in a few households at the top, seems to be a common pattern. If one was to look for some sort of good news on that, then I probably should mention this at the bottom, but certainly Xi Jinping has started talking about common prosperity in China, and that potentially seems to be an agenda for tackling the enormous inequality that's developed in China over the last 25 years. In terms of institutional change, well, certainly populist and nationalist tropes still seem to continue and be doing well. If we look at vaccine access, we'll look at some figures on that in a second, but certainly multilateralism doesn't seem to have managed to have met the vaccine access promises it made, and climate finance, in a way, is not inspiring. Back in Paris, the rich countries of the world committed themselves to $100 billion a year going for climate adaptation in poorer countries. We still haven't reached that figure now, and we're about to meet in Glasgow. So if I was looking for good news, well, maybe the changes in the USA in leadership could be seen as good news, but man, that Trump base is still there. The Republican Party still won't commit itself to tackling climate change or to reforming the oil and gas industry. China, maybe things are changing there. if we're looking for optimism, there may be science. We did have an amazing breakthrough with vaccinations. If we could get similar breakthroughs with carbon sequestration. I mean, just to illustrate some of the data on why things are bad. If we look at the COVID-19 doses administered, I'm sorry, the coding isn't showing up on this, but it's pretty clear. Dark green means that most of your population has been vaccinated, and the slightly deeper green means that almost it has been. Light green or yellow means that next to nobody has got access to vaccination. And as you'll see, there is a pattern across the tropics of countries not getting access to vaccines, but it's really Africa. Africa has been kept out of vaccines. I mean, that's why I think you can sort of interpret this as an international development, a global north, global south, but no, it's actually a global positioning of Africa. It's the way that Africa fits into the global economy, into global political economy, which is revealed by this. Things are not as bad in the Middle East or in South and Southeast Asia as they are in Africa. If we look at countries on track to be vaccinated, to get 40% of their population vaccinated. Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain is going its own unique way on this, but essentially we're saying it's the whole of Africa. At the present time, it looks like it'll be Africa, which is simply not achieving 40% and just not likely to achieve 40% on that. So this shows the way that, yeah, we still live in a system in which global development is not functioning well. If you look at income groups by country, then low-income countries barely show. Low and middle-income countries that have very large populations are low down. The vaccinations have tended to go to wealthier countries. In particular, Africa's been left out. Okay, I mean, I've come to the end there, but yeah, for me, I think COVID-19 has had tremendous proximate impacts, but I think the longer term impacts, I'd say that we've simply returned to the bad scenario that we were on for global development. And it looks like we're not going to deal adequately with climate change, and we're not going to tackle inequality. So we are likely to face accelerating problems at global and at national level in years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, David, for that very, very interesting talk. We'll have a break now so people can go and get a drink. So what time is it now? We're now, it's about, is it 8:20 about? So yes. If we come back about 8:30, we'll gather again and have the discussion. Okay. So do you want to just get rid of your talk from the screen? That'd be great. Thank you very much indeed, David.
See you in a few minutes.
Yeah, so sure. Okay. Do you want to go and get a drink?
Mute.
If people want to put a question into the chat, they can do so now. And or if you have questions you want to actually just ask, we'll call on you also.